Can you imagine dedicating your entire existence to nurturing someone only to watch helplessly as a predator slowly destroys everything you've built together? The kind of betrayal that doesn't just wound your heart, but creates a paralyzing fear that seems to consume your very soul. My name is Brenda, and for 30 years, I wove my life around my daughter Sarah. As a single mother, I worked double shifts and sacrificed my own dreams to ensure her education, her financial stability, and her bright future. I believed that by giving her every opportunity I'd never had, I was securing her happiness and independence. But when I discovered that her husband Arthur was systematically draining Sarah's inheritance money I'd worked decades to provide and tried to protect her, he revealed the true depth of his evil. With a cold smile that still haunts my nightmares, he showed me compromising photos he'd secretly taken of Sarah, intimate moments captured without her knowledge. "One wrong move," he whispered with chilling calm, "and your darling daughter's most private secrets will be plastered across the internet for the world to see." Yet in that moment of crushing terror, when Arthur thought he'd silence me forever, something unexpected stirred within me. Years ago, I'd given an encrypted backup of Sarah's digital memories to my friend David for safekeeping. Hidden within that data might be the very evidence I needed to break the serpent's hold on my daughter without destroying her in the process. Arthur's threat echoed in my mind every waking moment, like a death sentence hanging over both Sarah and me. One wrong move became the rhythm of my heartbeat, the whisper that followed me through sleepless nights and anxiety-filled days. My phone, once a source of connection to my daughter, now felt like a ticking bomb that could explode her life at any moment if I said the wrong thing or asked the wrong question. The visits to their house became exercises in psychological torture. I had to sit across from Sarah at their dinner table, watching her grow thinner and more withdrawn with each passing week, while maintaining the facade of a normal mother-in-law relationship. I searched desperately for signs in her eyes, some indication that she knew what was happening, some plea for help that I could safely acknowledge without triggering Arthur's promised retaliation. But Sarah seemed to be disappearing before my eyes, her vibrant personality fading like a photograph left too long in sunlight. The daughter who had once filled rooms with laughter and animated conversation now spoke in whispers, always glancing toward Arthur for approval before expressing even the most innocuous opinion. Her beautiful home, once a place of warmth and joy, had become a silent prison where every word was monitored and every gesture calculated. The worst part was the forced normalcy of it all. Arthur insisted on these regular family gatherings, these elaborate performances of domestic bliss that served as opportunities for him to demonstrate his complete control over both Sarah and me. He would greet me at the door with that charming smile that had once fooled me into thinking he was the perfect husband for my daughter. But now I could see the cold calculation behind his eyes. Arthur had perfected the art of appearing devoted while systematically destroying Sarah's independence and self-worth. He managed every aspect of her social calendar, always ensuring that he was present for any interaction she might have with friends or family. When I tried to call Sarah directly, Arthur would intercept the calls with practiced efficiency, claiming she was resting or busy with household tasks that seemed to multiply whenever I wanted to speak with her. His control extended far beyond simple scheduling. Arthur had appointed himself as Sarah's voice in almost every conversation, speaking for her, as if she were incapable of forming her own thoughts or opinions. When she did manage to contribute to discussions, he would subtly correct her statements, suggesting that her memory was unreliable or that she was misunderstanding situations that were too complex for her to grasp fully. The psychological manipulation was masterful in its subtlety. Arthur never raised his voice or displayed obvious anger. Instead, he used gentle corrections and concerned suggestions that painted him as the patient, understanding husband, helping his confused wife navigate a world that was apparently too challenging for her to handle alone. To outside observers, he appeared to be the ideal partner, devoted and protective. But I could see what this constant undermining was doing to Sarah's spirit. The confident young woman who had graduated summa cum laude from college, who had once managed complex projects with ease, was being systematically convinced that she couldn't be trusted to make even basic decisions about her own life. Arthur's gaslighting was so consistent and pervasive that Sarah was beginning to doubt her own perceptions and memories. Despite the growing evidence of Arthur's manipulation and the suffocating fear that his threats had created, part of me desperately clung to the hope that I was misreading the situation. Perhaps Arthur's controlling behavior stemmed from genuine love rather than malicious intent. Maybe he was simply overprotective, worried about Sarah's well-being in ways that manifested as excessive concern rather than deliberate abuse. I found myself making excuses for his behavior, searching for innocent explanations for actions that my instincts told me were dangerous. When Sarah canceled plans at the last minute or seemed reluctant to speak freely during our conversations, I convinced myself that she was simply tired from work or stressed about normal life challenges, rather than living under the constant threat of someone who held her most intimate secrets as weapons. The isolation was becoming complete and suffocating. Arthur had skillfully convinced Sarah to distance herself from old friends, claiming they were jealous of her happiness or bad influences who didn't understand their relationship. He had subtly discouraged her from pursuing hobbies and interests that might bring her into contact with other people, insisting that such activities were either too expensive or too demanding for someone who was already working so hard to maintain their household. During our supervised family gatherings, Arthur's humiliation of Sarah was a carefully orchestrated performance designed to demonstrate his absolute control while maintaining plausible deniability. He would gently correct her anecdotes, implying that she was prone to exaggeration or confusion about events they'd both experienced. His tone was always loving and patient, but the message was clear. Sarah couldn't be trusted to tell her own stories accurately. He made subtle comments about her poor spending habits, while simultaneously flaunting expensive purchases he'd made without her input, positioning himself as the responsible financial manager who had to compensate for her lack of judgment. These remarks were delivered with apparent affection, but they served to reinforce Sarah's growing belief that she was incompetent and dependent on his guidance for even basic life decisions. I watched helplessly as Arthur tightened his grip on every aspect of Sarah's existence, her finances, her social connections, her sense of self-worth. The vibrant, independent woman I'd raised was being systematically dismantled, replaced by someone who seemed afraid to express opinions or make decisions without his approval. The inheritance I'd worked so hard to provide money that was supposed to secure her independence had become the very tool being used to ensure her complete dependence on a man who viewed her as property rather than a partner. The knowledge of what Arthur could do with those compromising photos hung over every interaction like a sword of Damocles. One careless word from me, one attempt to warn Sarah or seek help from others, and her most private moments would become public entertainment for strangers on the internet. The thought of my daughter's dignity being destroyed in such a cruel and permanent way was more terrifying than any physical threat Arthur could have made against me directly. As months passed under Arthur's reign of psychological terror, his mask of charm began to slip away even during my visits, revealing glimpses of the monster that had been hiding beneath the surface all along. The careful facade he'd maintained was no longer necessary. He knew I was trapped by his threats, and Sarah was too broken to recognize the escalating abuse for what it truly was. Arthur started making openly cruel remarks about Sarah's appearance, commenting on her weight loss with mock concern, while simultaneously criticizing her for letting herself go. He would examine her clothing choices with the critical eye of someone inspecting damaged merchandise, suggesting that she needed to make more effort to maintain the standards he expected from his wife. These attacks on her physical appearance were delivered with the tone of helpful advice, but I could see how each comment chipped away at whatever remained of her self-esteem. The financial control became more overtly punitive. Arthur began deliberately withholding money for Sarah's personal needs, claiming that her requests for basic items like clothing or toiletries were evidence of her materialistic nature and inability to appreciate what she already had. He would make a show of reluctantly providing small amounts of cash for necessities, ensuring that Sarah felt like a beggar asking for charity rather than a woman accessing her own inheritance. During one particularly horrifying visit, I noticed bruises on Sarah's upper arm that she tried desperately to hide beneath a long-sleeved sweater despite the warm weather. When I expressed concern, she quickly dismissed them as results of her own clumsiness. But the fear in her eyes told a different story. Arthur watched this exchange with obvious satisfaction, enjoying both my helpless horror and Sarah's humiliation at having her injuries discovered. The bruises represented a terrifying escalation from psychological manipulation to physical violence. Arthur was no longer content with controlling Sarah through fear and financial dependence. He was now asserting his dominance through physical intimidation, safe in the knowledge that she was too isolated and afraid to seek help from anyone who might intervene on her behalf. The shattering moment of complete realization came through a desperate phone call that lasted only seconds, but confirmed my worst fears about the depths of Arthur's depravity. Sarah managed to call me while Arthur was briefly out of the house, her voice barely above a whisper and trembling with terror that was palpable even through the phone. "Mom, he knows everything." She said the words rushing together in her panic. "Don't say a word about anything. I can't live like this anymore. But if you try to help me, he'll destroy me completely. He has photos, videos, things that would ruin my life forever. Please don't try to save me. It will only make everything worse." The call ended abruptly, leaving me holding the phone and shaking with the force of what I'd just heard. The raw terror in Sarah's voice, the hopeless resignation, the chilling reference to photographic evidence that could destroy her, all of it, confirmed that Arthur's threats were not empty bluffs, but promises backed by concrete evidence that he was fully prepared to use. This wasn't just financial manipulation or even psychological abuse. It was complete psychological warfare designed to hold another human being in permanent captivity through the threat of public humiliation and social destruction. Arthur had turned Sarah's most intimate moments into weapons that he could deploy at will, ensuring that she would never feel safe enough to seek help or attempt to escape his control. The memories that flooded back in the aftermath of that phone call felt like physical blows to my already breaking heart. I remembered the sacrifices I'd made as a single mother, working double shifts at the hospital while taking night classes to improve my qualifications and earning potential. I'd denied myself vacations, new closed social opportunities, anything that would have diverted money or attention away from providing Sarah with the best possible future. I thought about selling my mother's antique jewelry pieces that had been passed down through 3 generations of women in our family to pay for Sarah's college education. Those heirlooms represented the only valuable things I'd inherited from my own family, but I'd traded them without hesitation for tuition payments and textbooks, believing that education would give Sarah the independence and opportunities I'd never had. I'd given up my own dreams of opening a small business, a flower shop that I'd planned and saved for throughout Sarah's childhood. When the time came to make the investment, I chose instead to keep that money available for Sarah's needs, to ensure that I could always be there when she needed support or assistance. Every decision I'd made had been filtered through the question of what would be best for Sarah's future. Now, seeing the results of all those sacrifices, understanding that the financial security I'd worked so hard to provide had become the very foundation of her imprisonment, felt like the cruelest possible irony. The inheritance that was supposed to liberate Sarah from the struggles I'd endured had instead made her a target for a predator who viewed her wealth as justification for his ownership of her entire existence. When I could no longer bear the agony of silent observation, I confronted Arthur directly, knowing it was dangerous, but unable to continue watching my daughter's systematic destruction without at least attempting to appeal to whatever humanity might still exist within him. I found him in his study, reviewing financial documents that probably represented more of Sarah's assets being transferred into accounts she couldn't access. "I know what you're doing to her," I said, my voice trembling with a mixture of grief and fury that I'd been suppressing for months. "She's my daughter, and I won't stand by and watch you destroy her life for money." Arthur's response was more chilling than any anger or defensiveness would have been. He simply smiled, a cold, calculating expression that revealed the complete absence of conscience or empathy. His reaction confirmed that he felt no shame about his actions, no concern about being discovered, and no fear of consequences for what he was doing to Sarah. "Did you think I wouldn't protect my investment, Brenda?" he said, his voice carrying the casual tone someone might use to discuss the weather. "Sarah is mine now in every way that matters. You should have minded your own business instead of trying to interfere with our marriage. All that money you wasted on her education and independence was just making her more valuable as a commodity." His words were delivered with such matter-of-fact cruelty that for a moment I wondered if I'd heard him correctly. He wasn't even attempting to justify his behavior or deny the accusations I'd made. He was simply asserting his ownership of Sarah as if she were property he'd legitimately acquired, rather than a human being he was systematically abusing. She needed a firm hand to reach her full potential. Arthur continued, clearly enjoying my shock and horror. Someone who understood how to properly manage both her assets and her personality. You raised her to be too independent, too confident in her own judgment. I've corrected those flaws. The immediate aftermath of this confrontation brought swift and devastating retaliation. Arthur presented me with legal documents that he'd apparently prepared in advance, anticipating this exact scenario. The non-disclosure agreement was comprehensive and binding, explicitly threatening to release Sarah's compromising material if I ever spoke to anyone about what I'd witnessed or suspected. Feeling utterly trapped and terrified for Sarah's welfare, I signed the documents with a hand that shook so violently I could barely control the pen. The last vestiges of my hope for direct intervention slipped away with each signature, leaving me feeling more defeated and powerless than I'd ever experienced in my life. Arthur had successfully silenced the only person who might have been able to help Sarah, ensuring that his psychological torture could continue without interference or accountability. The final cruelty that pushed me beyond the breaking point arrived in my mailbox 3 days after I'd signed Arthur's legal documents. It was a single photograph printed on ordinary paper with no return address or identifying marks, but its message was unmistakably clear and devastatingly effective. The image showed Sarah in a moment of intimate vulnerability, captured without her knowledge or consent, and served as Arthur's brutal reminder of the power he held over both of us. The photograph wasn't the most explicit or damaging image he could have sent. It was carefully chosen to demonstrate his willingness to act on his threats without completely destroying Sarah's dignity in one move. It was a warning shot, a preview of the devastation he could unleash if I stepped out of line again. The psychological impact was devastating, confirming that Arthur's collection of compromising material was real and that he was prepared to use it without hesitation. Seeing that image of my daughter, knowing that a predator had violated her privacy so completely and was now using those violations to control our entire family, sent me into the darkest emotional abyss I'd ever experienced. The suffocating combination of fear for Sarah's welfare, rage at my own powerlessness, and horror at Arthur's complete lack of humanity created a perfect storm of despair that threatened to consume me entirely. I couldn't eat anything without my stomach immediately rejecting it. Sleep became impossible as my mind raced through increasingly desperate scenarios, each one ending with Sarah's destruction or my own complete helplessness. The physical symptoms of chronic stress began manifesting in ways that frightened me: chest pains, difficulty breathing, tremors that made simple tasks nearly impossible to complete. The photograph sat on my kitchen table like a piece of evidence from a crime scene, too dangerous to keep, but too important to destroy. It represented everything that was wrong with our situation: Arthur's violation of Sarah's privacy, his manipulation of our family relationships, his absolute confidence that he could act without consequences. Looking at it made me physically ill, but I couldn't bring myself to throw it away because it was proof of crimes that no one else would ever be allowed to acknowledge. During my darkest moments, I contemplated simply giving up entirely. The weight of knowing that my daughter was suffering while I was powerless to help her felt unbearable. I found myself thinking about what would happen if I were no longer around to worry about Arthur's threats, whether my absence might somehow free Sarah from the additional burden of protecting me from his retaliation. But in the depths of this despair, my mind drifted to a conversation I'd had with my old friend David several years earlier. David had retired from a career in digital forensics, spending his final working years helping law enforcement agencies recover evidence from computers and electronic devices. He had always been fascinated by technology and had often spoken about the hidden information that exists in digital files, metadata, timestamps, and other technical details that most people never notice, but that can reveal important truths about how and when data was created. Years ago, when Sarah had been going through a difficult period and wanted to preserve some of her favorite digital memories, I'd asked David to help create a secure backup of her photos, videos, and social media posts. He'd stored everything on an encrypted hard drive that he kept in his home safe, promising to return it if anything ever happened to Sarah's original files. At the time, it had seemed like a simple favor for a friend insurance against the kind of technical failures that could erase years of precious memories. Now, lying in my bedroom and staring at the ceiling while my mind raced through impossible scenarios, I remembered something David had mentioned during that conversation. He'd said that he always performed basic scans on any data he backed up, looking for anomalies or potential problems that might indicate corruption or unauthorized access. It was a professional habit that he'd maintained even in retirement, an automatic process that ensured the integrity of the files he was preserving. A flicker of possibility began to grow in my mind. If David had scanned Sarah's digital memories during the backup process, and if Arthur had been accessing her accounts or devices even before their marriage, there might be evidence of his early manipulation hidden in the technical details of those files. It wouldn't be obvious or dramatic evidence. Arthur was too careful and sophisticated for that, but it might be enough to establish a pattern of unauthorized access that could be used against him. The thought of contacting David felt both hopeful and terrifying. On one hand, it represented the first potential path forward I'd seen since Arthur had trapped us in this nightmare. On the other hand, any action I took carried the risk of triggering his promised retaliation against Sarah. The non-disclosure agreement I'd signed made it clear that even indirect attempts to gather evidence could be considered violations that would result in Sarah's private material being released publicly. But as I lay there clutching the photograph Arthur had sent me, feeling the weight of my daughter's suffering and my own powerlessness, I realized that doing nothing was also a choice to allow Arthur's abuse to continue indefinitely, while Sarah's spirit and independence were systematically destroyed. The status quo wasn't sustainable. Sarah was already expressing thoughts about not being able to live like this anymore, and I feared what might happen if her despair deepened further. Fueled by a desperate, agonizing need to save my daughter from complete psychological destruction, I felt a reluctant but steely resolve beginning to form within me. The fear of Arthur's retaliation would never disappear, but it was being joined by an even stronger fear of what would happen to Sarah if I continued to do nothing while her abuser tightened his grip on her life. I decided to contact David, not to ask him to become directly involved in our situation, but simply to inquire about the backup files he'd created. If there was evidence of Arthur's early manipulation hidden in Sarah's digital history, it might provide a foundation for action that didn't rely on direct confrontation or public accusations. It was a long shot, and the risks were enormous, but it felt like the only path forward that offered any hope of breaking Arthur's hold on our family. The decision to reach out for help, even in this limited and indirect way, felt like taking the first breath after nearly drowning. I wasn't sure what David might find in those old files, or whether any evidence that existed would be strong enough to use against someone as careful and manipulative as Arthur. But for the first time since this nightmare began, I had a plan that didn't require me to remain completely passive while my daughter's life was destroyed. Sitting in my kitchen with that terrible photograph still lying before me, I felt the beginnings of something I'd almost forgotten existed: hope. It was fragile and tentative, tempered by the knowledge of how much Arthur could still do to hurt Sarah if he discovered my investigation. But it was also fueled by the fierce love that had motivated every sacrifice I'd made as a mother, and by the understanding that some fights are worth the risk because the alternative surrender is simply unacceptable. The serpent had wrapped his coils around my daughter, using her own trust and intimacy against her to maintain control. But perhaps hidden in the digital breadcrumbs of their early relationship, there was evidence that could help me find a way to cut through those coils without destroying Sarah in the process. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep fighting for the daughter I'd never stopped loving, even when saving her seemed impossible. The meeting with David took place in his modest home office, surrounded by the quiet hum of computers and the faint smell of coffee that had grown cold hours earlier. Explaining the depth of Arthur's blackmail scheme felt like tearing open a wound that had barely begun to scab over. Each detail I shared, the compromising photographs, the financial manipulation, Sarah's whispered plea for help, required me to relive the horror of watching my daughter's systematic destruction while being powerless to intervene. David listened with the patient attention of someone who had spent decades hearing about the worst things people could do to each other through technology. His weathered face remained calm and professional as I described Arthur's threats, but I could see the anger flickering in his eyes when I explained how those intimate photos were being used to hold Sarah captive in her own marriage. "I've seen cases like this before," David said quietly, retrieving the encrypted hard drive from his safe. "Digital predators who use technology to groom and control their victims. The evidence is often hiding in plain sight, embedded in the technical details that most people never think to examine." Handing over that hard drive felt like passing him the last hope I had of saving Sarah without triggering Arthur's promised retaliation. The files contained years of her digital memories, photos from college social media posts documenting her friendships and achievements, videos of family celebrations when she still smiled with genuine joy. All of it now potentially contaminated by Arthur's early intrusions, but perhaps containing the proof I needed to expose his predatory behavior. The process would take time, David explained. He would need to examine thousands of files, looking for anomalies in the metadata that might indicate unauthorized access or manipulation. It was painstaking work that required both technical expertise and investigative intuition, the kind of digital archaeology that could reveal hidden truths about when and how files had been accessed or modified. While David began his methodical analysis, Arthur continued tightening his control over Sarah with the confidence of someone who believed his victory was complete. He dismissed any subtle changes in my demeanor during our supervised visits, interpreting my newfound sense of purpose as evidence of my total defeat rather than the beginning of my counterattack. His arrogance worked in our favor, making him careless about covering tracks he didn't realize were being examined. Arthur's treatment of Sarah became even more overtly controlling as he savored what he believed was his triumph over both of us. He reduced her personal allowance to almost nothing, forcing her to ask permission for even the most basic purchases, and then questioning whether each expense was truly necessary. The humiliation was deliberate and systematic, designed to reinforce her complete dependence on his approval for every aspect of her daily existence. He also intensified Sarah's isolation from anyone who might offer support or alternative perspectives on her situation. Old friends who tried to maintain contact found their calls intercepted or their invitations declined on Sarah's behalf. Arthur claimed to be protecting her from people who were jealous of their happiness or who didn't understand the depth of their commitment to each other. After 2 weeks of intensive analysis, David called me with news that sent chills down my spine. Hidden in the metadata of Sarah's early social media posts, content she'd created months before she'd even met Arthur, were digital fingerprints that told a horrifying story of long-term stalking and manipulation. The IP addresses don't match Sarah's known internet connections. David explained, his voice tight with controlled anger. Someone was accessing her accounts remotely, probably through malware or compromised passwords, months before she started dating Arthur. They were studying her patterns, her interests, her vulnerabilities. This wasn't a crime of opportunity. It was a carefully planned hunt. The evidence was technical and subtle, but absolutely irrefutable. Arthur hadn't simply stumbled into Sarah's life. and gradually revealed his controlling nature. He had selected her as a target, studied her digital behavior, and crafted his approach based on detailed knowledge of her personality and preferences. The romantic courtship she remembered had been a performance based on stolen information about her dreams and desires. This discovery should have felt like vindication proof that my instincts about Arthur's predatory nature had been correct all along. Instead, it brought only a crushing sense of sorrow for the extent of Sarah's victimization. She hadn't just married an abuser, she'd been selected and groomed by a sophisticated predator who had violated her privacy for months before ever speaking to her. The evidence David had uncovered was a significant crack in Arthur's facade, but it also confirmed the absolute brokenness of Sarah's situation. Every moment of their early relationship had been built on deception and manipulation. The man she'd fallen in love with had never really existed. He'd been a carefully constructed persona designed to exploit her specific vulnerabilities. Arthur, somehow sensing a shift in the dynamic despite his apparent confidence, began reacting to threats he couldn't quite identify. Sarah's demeanor during our brief phone conversations carried a barely perceptible note of hope that I'd tried to hide, but apparently failed to completely suppress. Her abuser's finely tuned instincts for control detected this change and triggered escalated threats designed to crush any emerging resistance. During one of their supervised visits to my house, Arthur made a seemingly casual comment that chilled me to the bone. It's amazing how quickly people's reputations can be destroyed when embarrassing secrets come to light, he said, his eyes fixed on Sarah's face as he spoke. The internet never forgets, and some things can never be taken back once they're out there. Sarah's reaction to these veiled threats was immediate and devastating. The small spark of hope I glimpsed in her eyes was extinguished, instantly replaced by the familiar terror that had become her constant companion. Arthur's message was clear. Any attempt to seek help or resist his control would result in her complete social destruction. Simultaneously, Arthur began spreading subtle rumors about my mental state to distant relatives and family friends. He portrayed himself as a concerned son-in-law who was worried about my obsessive behavior and declining ability to accept Sarah's happiness in her marriage. These character assassinations were delivered with apparent reluctance and concern, making them more believable to people who didn't understand the true nature of our situation. The weight of this escalating conflict settled over me like a heavy blanket of exhaustion and grim determination. I was fighting a war where any visible progress brought immediate retaliation against Sarah, where every small victory was overshadowed by the knowledge of how much more suffering lay ahead. But David's evidence had given me something I'd almost lost: concrete proof that Arthur was indeed the monster I'd believed him to be, and a foundation for actions that might eventually break his hold on my daughter's life. On a gray Sunday afternoon, I found myself driving past the house where Sarah had grown up, the small colonial with blue shutters that I'd sold 5 years earlier to help fund her graduate education. The new owners had painted it white and replaced the flower gardens I'd tended for decades with low-maintenance shrubs, but the basic structure remained unchanged, holding memories that felt both precious and impossibly distant. Standing on the sidewalk where I'd once waited for the school bus with a young Sarah, I looked up at the window of her former bedroom and was overwhelmed by images from a happier time. I could almost see her 10-year-old face pressed against the glass, watching for my car to pull into the driveway after my evening shift at the hospital. In those days, her eyes had been bright with trust and excitement about the world, unmarked by the fear and resignation that now defined her daily existence. The vibrant colors of our shared past seemed muted by the gray reality of Arthur's influence, as if his presence had drained the life from even my most cherished memories. The daughter who had once filled this house with laughter and endless questions about everything from astronomy to art, history was now a shadow of herself, her voice carefully modulated to avoid triggering her husband's displeasure. I remembered the dreams Sarah had shared during those late-night conversations when she couldn't sleep, ambitious plans for traveling the world and starting her own business that would combine her love of photography with her desire to help others. She'd been so confident in her abilities, so certain that she could create a life filled with adventure and meaningful work. Now those dreams seemed as abandoned as the flower gardens that had once bloomed in our front yard. As I stood there, I couldn't help but imagine Arthur's presence contaminating these sacred spaces, his predatory instincts having identified and targeted Sarah, even during the innocent years when she'd felt safe and protected. The knowledge that he'd been digitally stalking her months before their first meeting meant that his shadow had been lurking in the corners of her life, even when she'd still lived in this house with me. The mental image of Arthur studying Sarah's online activities from some distant location, cataloging her interests and vulnerabilities while she went about her daily routine unaware of being hunted, was more painful than any financial loss could ever be. He hadn't just stolen her inheritance, he'd stolen her sense of safety in the world, her ability to trust her own judgment, her fundamental understanding of herself as a capable and independent person. The violation went deeper than money or even physical abuse. Arthur had turned Sarah's own personality against her, using her kindness and trust as weapons to ensure her compliance with his demands. The qualities I'd admired most about my daughter, her empathy, her willingness to see the best in others, her loyalty to those she loved, had been systematically exploited by someone who viewed them as weaknesses to be manipulated rather than strengths to be celebrated. That evening, Sarah called me from her house, but the conversation felt like communicating with someone trapped underwater. I could hear Arthur's presence in every pause, every carefully chosen word, every forced note of cheerfulness that couldn't quite mask the underlying desperation in her voice. She mentioned Arthur's exciting new business venture with an enthusiasm that rang completely hollow, as if she were reading from a script he'd prepared for her. He's been working so hard on expanding his consulting practice, Sarah said, her words coming out slightly too fast. It's really wonderful to see him so passionate about helping other people with their financial planning. The irony of Arthur being described as someone who helped others with financial planning when he was systematically draining his own wife's inheritance would have been darkly funny if it weren't so tragic. Sarah was being forced to participate in her own deception to speak publicly about her abuser's fictional virtues, while he stood close enough to monitor every word she spoke. Through Sarah's strained words, I could almost hear Arthur's silent taunts, his smug confidence that he had achieved complete victory over both of us. He was communicating through her enforced silence, using her inability to speak freely as proof of his total control over our family dynamics. Every conversation was a demonstration of his power, a reminder that Sarah existed entirely at his mercy and that I was helpless to protect her. The very fact that Sarah couldn't express genuine thoughts or feelings, that every interaction had to be filtered through the lens of Arthur's approval, served as a constant and cruel reminder of how thoroughly he had dominated her life. Her voice had become his voice, her words carefully crafted to serve his narrative rather than express her authentic thoughts or emotions. But in that moment of crushing awareness of how controlled Sarah had become, I decided to try something that Arthur couldn't easily monitor or prevent. Instead of pushing for details about her situation or asking questions that might trigger his retaliation, I reached for something deeper and more fundamental, a connection to the person Sarah had been before Arthur's manipulation had begun reshaping her identity. "Sarah," I said softly, "do you remember your favorite lullaby, the one I used to sing to you when you couldn't sleep?" There was a slight intake of breath on the other end of the line, a barely perceptible pause that told me everything I needed to know. Despite all of Arthur's psychological manipulation, despite the fear and isolation he'd imposed on her life, some part of my daughter's authentic self remained intact. She remembered those quiet moments when it had been just the two of us, when love had been simple and uncomplicated by the presence of predators who viewed vulnerability as opportunity. "I remember," she whispered so quietly that I almost missed the words. It was a small moment, lasting only seconds, but it represented something Arthur couldn't control or contaminate. The bond between mother and daughter that had been forged through years of genuine care and protection was still there, buried beneath layers of fear and manipulation, but not completely destroyed. That lullaby belonged to us to a time when Sarah had felt safe and loved without condition or threat. Arthur might have succeeded in controlling Sarah's actions, her words, even her apparent thoughts and feelings. But he couldn't erase the foundation of love and trust that had shaped her character during the years before he'd entered her life. Those memories of safety and unconditional acceptance remained as a quiet refuge that no amount of psychological abuse could completely eliminate. As I hung up the phone, I felt a flicker of something I'd almost forgotten existed: defiant dignity. Arthur's campaign to break both Sarah and me had been sophisticated and brutal, but it hadn't achieved total victory. Some essential part of who we were remained beyond his reach, protected by the strength of genuine love and the memories of a time when such love had been freely given and gratefully received. Armed with David's irrefutable digital evidence, I met with my attorney, Elizabeth Chen, in her downtown office that overlooked the courthouse where so many legal battles had been fought and won. The evidence David had compiled was technical and complex, but it painted an undeniable picture of Arthur's predatory behavior that extended back months before he'd ever approached Sarah directly. Elizabeth reviewed the forensic analysis with the careful attention of someone who understood both the legal implications and the human cost of what we were examining. The metadata anomalies, the suspicious IP, addresses the pattern of unauthorized access to Sarah's accounts. All of it formed a comprehensive picture of systematic stalking and preparation for financial exploitation. This is compelling evidence of premeditated fraud, Elizabeth said, her voice tight with controlled anger. Arthur didn't just stumble into an opportunity to abuse Sarah. He selected her as a target and spent months planning his approach. That level of premeditation makes this a serious criminal matter, not just a civil dispute. The legal strategy Elizabeth developed was necessarily cautious and indirect. Any overt legal action against Arthur would likely trigger his promised retaliation against Sarah, potentially destroying her reputation and mental health, even if we ultimately succeeded in holding him accountable for his crimes. Instead, we would approach the financial institutions handling Sarah's inheritance with evidence of suspicious activity that demanded investigation. Elizabeth initiated discreet inquiries with the bank that managed Sarah's trust funds, presenting David's forensic evidence as part of a routine audit request. The bank's internal security department was trained to recognize signs of financial elder abuse and identity theft. and the patterns David had uncovered triggered immediate concern among their fraud prevention specialists. Each step of this process was excruciating for me, requiring clinical discussions about my daughter's victimization while maintaining the emotional distance necessary for effective legal strategy. I had to transform my maternal anguish into actionable evidence, turning my intimate knowledge of Sarah's suffering into documentation that could be presented to institutions and officials who had never met her. Arthur, sensing that his carefully constructed world was beginning to shift in ways he couldn't control, retaliated with vicious efficiency. Using Sarah's email account, undoubtedly under duress, he sent fabricated messages to our extended family, claiming that I was suffering from age-related mental decline and that my obsessive accusations against him were causing Sarah tremendous stress and emotional harm. The email, supposedly written by Sarah herself, described me as an increasingly unstable mother who couldn't accept her daughter's happiness and was creating dangerous situations with false accusations against her devoted husband. The language was carefully crafted to seem like Sarah's voice, while serving Arthur's purpose of discrediting any revelations that might emerge from my investigation. These character assassinations were particularly cruel because they used Sarah's apparent voice to attack me, forcing her to participate in her own mother's destruction while serving Arthur's interests. People who received these messages had no way of knowing that Sarah was being compelled to send them, that every word had been chosen by her abuser to serve his campaign of intimidation and control. Arthur also escalated his threats against Sarah, directly making her daily existence even more unbearable, as punishment for the hope she'd briefly allowed herself to feel. Her already restricted freedom was curtailed further, her access to phones and computers monitored more closely, her isolation from any potential sources of support made even more complete. The breakthrough came during a private meeting between Elizabeth and a high-ranking official at the bank who specialized in financial crimes against vulnerable adults. Elizabeth presented David's comprehensive forensic report, which meticulously documented Arthur's early digital intrusions and cross-referenced them with suspicious financial transactions that had occurred throughout his relationship with Sarah. The evidence was devastating in its thoroughness. David had traced Arthur's digital footprints across multiple platforms and time periods, showing how he'd gathered intelligence about Sarah's financial assets, her family relationships, and her personal vulnerabilities. The forensic analysis revealed that Arthur had accessed Sarah's accounts to review her banking information, her investment portfolios, and even her correspondence with financial advisors, all before they'd ever gone on their first date. Most damning was the timeline that showed Arthur's systematic approach to gaining control over Sarah's assets. He'd used the information gathered through his unauthorized access to craft his romantic pursuit, timing his proposals for financial consolidation to coincide with periods when Sarah was most emotionally vulnerable or isolated from potential advisors. The bank official, recognizing both the gravity of the evidence and the sensitivity of the situation, launched an immediate internal investigation. The institution had legal obligations to protect their clients from financial exploitation, and the documentation Elizabeth presented clearly showed that Sarah was the victim of a sophisticated fraud scheme that had been planned and executed over an extended period. The bank's response was swift and decisive. They imposed an immediate temporary freeze on any further transactions from Sarah's inheritance accounts, pending a comprehensive review of all activities since Arthur had gained access to the funds. The freeze was justified by irregularities in the account activity that required investigation, a euphemistic description that masked the serious criminal behavior the bank suspected. Arthur was blindsided by this sudden loss of access to Sarah's money. The easy financial exploitation that had funded his lifestyle and given him additional leverage over Sarah was cut off without warning. His face, when he learned about the freeze during a call to the bank, reportedly transformed into a mask of fear and rage that revealed the depth of his dependence on Sarah's inheritance for his own financial security. For the first time since this nightmare had begun, Arthur found himself in a position where his actions had triggered consequences he couldn't control or manipulate. The financial institutions he'd been exploiting had turned against him, armed with evidence of his criminal behavior that he couldn't dismiss or explain away. Despite this significant victory, I felt no triumph or celebration. The bank's action was an important step toward protecting Sarah's remaining assets, but it couldn't undo the months of psychological torture she'd endured or restore the trust and independence that Arthur had systematically destroyed. It felt like a funeral for the carefree daughter I'd once known, with the official investigation marking the definitive end of any hope that Sarah's life could return to normal. The legal victory was meaningful in practical terms, but it came at an enormous emotional cost. Every document Elizabeth filed, every meeting with bank officials, every piece of evidence we presented was another confirmation of how thoroughly Arthur had violated Sarah's privacy and autonomy. The process of seeking justice felt like performing an autopsy on my daughter's destroyed life, examining each wound with clinical precision while trying to maintain hope that something could still be saved. The bank's freeze on Sarah's inheritance accounts triggered Arthur's most desperate and manipulative performance yet. 3 days after he discovered his access to her funds had been cut off, he appeared at my front door with Sarah in tow, both of them presenting a carefully orchestrated tableau of distressed innocence that might have been convincing to someone who didn't understand the true dynamics of their relationship. Arthur's appearance was disheveled in a calculated way that suggested urgent concern rather than the panic I suspected he was actually feeling. Sarah stood slightly behind him, her face pale and her eyes wide, with an expression that could have been interpreted as worry about her mother's mental state, but which I recognized as terror about what Arthur might do if this performance failed to achieve his objectives. "Brenda, please," Arthur began, his voice carrying just the right note of desperate sincerity. "This whole situation has gotten completely out of hand. The bank is treating us like criminals when all we've done is try to manage Sarah's inheritance responsibly. You're destroying your own daughter's life with these baseless accusations." His performance was masterful, combining apparent vulnerability with subtle accusations designed to make me feel responsible for the crisis he'd created. Arthur positioned himself as the wronged party, the devoted husband whose only crime had been loving Sarah enough to help her manage finances that were apparently too complex for her to handle independently. "Think of what this is doing to Sarah," he continued, his voice cracking with calculated emotion. "She loves me, Brenda. We're building a life together, and your interference is tearing apart everything we've worked for. You don't want to see her suffer like this, do you? You're her mother. You're supposed to protect her happiness, not destroy it." Sarah, clearly under enormous pressure to support Arthur's narrative, echoed his pleas with words that sounded like they'd been rehearsed. Her voice was hollow and mechanical as she spoke about her love for Arthur and her confusion about why I was attacking their marriage. The performance was heartbreaking to witness, knowing that every word was being extracted from her through threats and psychological manipulation. But the sight of my daughter being used as a prop in Arthur's desperate attempt to regain control over his schemes triggered something cold and implacable within me. The months of watching Sarah's systematic destruction, the knowledge of how thoroughly Arthur had violated her privacy and autonomy, the understanding that his love was nothing more than ownership, all of it crystallized into a resolve that felt as solid as granite. I looked at them both standing on my doorstep, Arthur's mask of concern barely concealing his rage at losing access to Sarah's money, and Sarah's terrified compliance with his demands for her to participate in this charade. The full weight of what Arthur had done to my family, the complete corruption of what should have been a loving marriage, settled over me with devastating clarity. Arthur, I said, my voice quiet but steady, with the kind of calm that comes from finally understanding exactly what needs to be done. Your manipulation ends here. Your financial exploitation has been exposed. Your digital stalking documented your systematic abuse of Sarah brought to light. There is nothing left for us to discuss because there is nothing left for you to steal or destroy. I turned to Sarah, whose eyes were filled with a mixture of hope and terror that broke my heart, even as it strengthened my resolve. Sarah, I want you to know that I love you and I believe in your strength. No matter what he's told you about yourself, no matter how powerless he's made you feel, you are stronger than he is. You always have been. The words weren't a plea or a negotiation. They were a statement of truth that Arthur couldn't argue with or manipulate. I wasn't asking Sarah to choose between us or demanding that she take action she might not be ready for. I was simply reminding her of who she really was beneath all the layers of fear and manipulation that Arthur had wrapped around her identity. Arthur's facade began cracking as he realized that his performance wasn't having the desired effect. The desperation in his voice became more pronounced as he shifted tactics, alternating between threats about what my interference would cost Sarah and appeals to maternal guilt about destroying her happiness. But his words carried no power over someone who had finally seen him clearly. After they left, I sat in the silence of my living room, holding a childhood drawing Sarah had made for me when she was 8 years old. It showed our family as stick figures, holding hands beneath a bright yellow sun, with "I love you, Mommy," written in purple crayon across the bottom. The innocence and joy captured in that simple drawing felt like evidence from another universe, proof that love and happiness had once existed before Arthur had poisoned everything he touched. A profound sadness washed over me as I allowed myself to fully acknowledge what had been lost. I pictured a different life where Arthur had never entered our world, where Sarah was free to pursue her dreams and build relationships based on genuine affection rather than fear and manipulation. In that alternate reality, Sarah was traveling the world with her camera, creating art that celebrated beauty rather than hiding from threats that should never have existed. The future we would never have together stretched out before me like a vast emptiness. No shared holidays, without the shadow of abuse, no grandchildren I could spoil, without worrying about their exposure to Arthur's influence. No comfortable conversations about growing older, together without the weight of secrets and fears that now defined our relationship. But dwelling on what might have been was a luxury I could no longer afford. The bank's investigation was ongoing, and there would likely be additional legal proceedings that would require my testimony and continued involvement. More importantly, Sarah was still trapped in a relationship that was destroying her day by day, and any chance of her eventual freedom depended on maintaining the pressure that was finally making Arthur's position untenable. I made a series of decisions that felt both necessary and heartbreaking. Working with Elizabeth, I legally restructured the inheritance funds that had been frozen, placing them in a protected trust that Sarah could only access if she was demonstrably free from Arthur's influence. The arrangement would ensure that even if Arthur found ways to circumvent the current legal restrictions, he would never again have easy access to the money that had enabled his control over Sarah's life. I also took steps to protect myself from Arthur's continuing attempts at intimidation and manipulation. I changed my phone number and arranged to move to a smaller house across town, creating physical and emotional distance from the situation that had consumed my life for so many months. The decision to move felt like admitting defeat in some ways, but it was also an act of self-preservation that would allow me to continue fighting for Sarah without being constantly vulnerable to Arthur's psychological attacks. Most difficult of all, I packed away all the photographs and mementos that included Arthur not out of bitterness, but out of a need to create an emotional environment that wasn't constantly contaminated by reminders of his presence in our family. The pictures of Sarah's wedding, the holiday gatherings where Arthur had played the role of devoted son-in-law, the casual snapshots that had once seemed to document a happy family, all of it went into storage where it couldn't continue inflicting daily wounds. The act felt like conducting a funeral for the family I'd thought we were acknowledging, that the relationships I'd believed in had been built on lies and manipulation from the very beginning. Arthur's presence had corrupted not just our current reality, but also our past, turning cherished memories into evidence of how thoroughly he'd deceived us all. As I sealed the last box of photographs, I felt a strange mixture of grief and liberation. The pain of losing the daughter I'd raised and the son-in-law I'd trusted was profound and would probably never fully heal. But the constant vigilance required to navigate Arthur's manipulation, the fear of triggering his retaliation against Sarah, the exhausting effort of trying to maintain relationships that existed only at his sufferance, all of that was finally over. I had cut the last threads connecting me to Arthur's web of control, creating space for whatever healing might be possible, while ensuring that Sarah's inheritance would be protected regardless of what happened to their marriage. It wasn't the victory I'd hoped for when this nightmare began, but it was a form of justice that honored both Sarah's well-being and my own need to stop being complicit in her ongoing abuse. The bank's investigation concluded 6 weeks after it had begun, and while no grand public trial ensued a deliberate choice to protect Sarah from further humiliation, the findings were comprehensive and damning. Arthur was formally sanctioned by the financial institution, his access to Sarah's inheritance permanently revoked, and his name flagged in databases that would prevent him from easily exploiting other vulnerable individuals in the future. The beauty of institutional justice was its quiet efficiency. Arthur couldn't argue with computer records, couldn't charm his way past forensic evidence, couldn't manipulate federal banking regulations the way he'd manipulated human emotions. The documentation David had compiled formed an unassailable case that resulted in consequences Arthur couldn't evade or minimize through his usual tactics of gaslighting and emotional manipulation. Word of the financial irregularities began spreading through Arthur's professional circles, with the inexorable persistence of water finding its way through cracks in a foundation. Other financial advisors, accountants, and business associates who had once welcomed Arthur's networking attempts now viewed him with suspicion and distaste. The carefully cultivated reputation he'd built over years of successful manipulation crumbled as people began reassessing their previous interactions with him through the lens of his documented predatory behavior. The whispers weren't dramatic or explosive. They were the kind of quiet, persistent undermining that Arthur had once used against others, but now found turned against himself. Former colleagues mentioned their discomfort with his tactics to mutual acquaintances. Potential clients who had been considering his services decided to work with other advisors instead. Professional organizations quietly declined to renew his memberships without providing detailed explanations. Arthur's systematic approach to charm and manipulation, which had once opened doors and created opportunities, now worked against him as people recognized the calculated nature of his previous interactions. What had once seemed like impressive social skills now looked like the techniques of a sophisticated con artist, and those who had fallen for his act felt embarrassed about their earlier gullibility. His social standing within the community began deteriorating as the truth about his financial crimes spread through networks of mutual acquaintances. The country club where he'd entertained clients started declining his attempts to book private events. The charity boards, where he'd positioned himself as a generous contributor, quietly removed his name from their promotional materials. The dinner parties and social gatherings that had once provided him with access to potential victims gradually stopped including him on their guest lists. But perhaps most devastating to Arthur's sense of control was the subtle change in Sarah's demeanor as his financial leverage over her began to weaken. With the inheritance funds protected in a trust she could access independently, Sarah no longer had to beg for money to buy basic necessities or tolerate his humiliating lectures about her supposed financial irresponsibility. The psychological impact of this shift was profound and immediately visible to anyone who knew how to look for the signs. Sarah began speaking in complete sentences, again rather than the fragmented, uncertain phrases that had characterized her speech during the worst of Arthur's psychological abuse. She started expressing preferences about small things, what to order at restaurants, which television programs to watch, without immediately looking to Arthur for approval or correction. These tiny flickers of independent spirit, barely noticeable to casual observers, amplified Arthur's frustration and sense of losing control in ways that made his desperation increasingly visible to others. He began interrupting Sarah more frequently during conversations, correcting her statements with obvious irritation rather than the patient condescension he'd previously employed. His mask of devoted husband was slipping, revealing glimpses of the angry, controlling personality that had always lurked beneath the surface. Arthur's financial schemes, which had once seemed so lucrative and sophisticated, began unraveling under the scrutiny that his exposure had brought. Other institutions where he maintained accounts started conducting their own reviews of his activities, discovering additional irregularities that painted a picture of systematic fraud extending far beyond his exploitation of Sarah. The cascade effect was both swift and merciless. As each new investigation uncovered additional evidence of Arthur's criminal behavior, his ability to maintain the lifestyle and social standing that had attracted victims like Sarah evaporated completely. He was left increasingly desperate and isolated with his meticulously crafted image of success crumbling around him like a house of cards in a strong wind. Throughout this period of quiet vindication, I maintained the same dignity that had sustained me through the worst of Arthur's threats and manipulation. I didn't seek out opportunities to gloat over his downfall or share details of what I discovered about his predatory behavior. The truth was speaking for itself through official channels and institutional consequences, and I had no desire to become personally involved in his public humiliation. Instead, I focused on the more difficult work of rebuilding my own life and finding ways to support Sarah's gradual recovery without interfering in the delicate process of her reclaiming her independence. The victory felt hollow in many ways. Arthur's exposure couldn't undo the months of psychological torture Sarah had endured or restore the innocence and trust that his manipulation had destroyed. A few long-standing acquaintances, hearing whispers of the truth about what had happened to our family, reached out with genuine expressions of empathy and quiet support. These were people who had known Sarah since her childhood and had recognized that something was fundamentally wrong with her marriage, even when they couldn't identify the specific problem. Their gestures of friendship were tentative but meaningful invitations to coffee offers to help with practical tasks, expressions of regret about not speaking up when they'd sensed that something wasn't right. I accepted their kindness with deep gratitude, recognizing these connections as proof that genuine human empathy could still exist even after experiencing the worst that human nature had to offer. But despite the quiet vindication and the growing recognition among those who mattered that I had fought a necessary battle against a genuine predator, a profound sense of isolation continued to define my daily existence. The experience had fundamentally altered my ability to trust completely or connect with others without reservation, creating barriers that no amount of external validation could completely remove. The justice we'd achieved came at an enormous cost. Sarah's enduring trauma, the complete destruction of our family as it had once existed, and the permanent loss of the innocent faith in human goodness that had once characterized both our personalities. Every new acquaintance felt like a cautious experiment. Every gesture of friendship filtered through hard-won knowledge about how effectively kindness could be weaponized by those who understood human vulnerabilities. My truth was now understood by a discerning few, but my heart remained marked by the knowledge that even maternal love could be used as a weapon against both mother and child by someone skilled in psychological manipulation. The scars left by Arthur's campaign of terror would always be visible to those who knew how to look for them, permanent reminders of battles that should never have been necessary to fight. With Arthur's financial control over Sarah significantly weakened and her inheritance protected in a trust that prioritized her well-being over his access to funds, I began the slow and often painful process of rebuilding a life that bore little resemblance to anything I'd previously imagined for myself. The woman who had once defined herself primarily through her role as Sarah's mother needed to discover who she might become in a world where that relationship existed under the permanent shadow of trauma and betrayal. I embraced my solitude not as a defeat, but as a necessary foundation for whatever healing might be possible. My new daily routines were deliberately simple and contained morning walks through neighborhoods where I was unlikely to encounter reminders of the past afternoons spent reading books that transported me to worlds uncomplicated by digital predators, and psychological manipulation evenings devoted to quiet activities that required no interaction with others unless I specifically chose to seek it out. The most meaningful part of my new life emerged when I began volunteering at a local women's shelter, working with survivors of domestic abuse who were rebuilding their lives after escaping relationships that had systematically destroyed their sense of self-worth and independence. My own experience with Arthur's manipulation, while different in its specific details, had given me insights into the psychological tactics that predators use to maintain control over their victims. Working with these brave women, I discovered that my pain could be transformed into purpose in ways I'd never anticipated. The knowledge I'd gained about financial abuse, digital stalking, and psychological manipulation became tools I could use to help others recognize the warning signs of predatory behavior and develop strategies for protecting themselves and their children from similar exploitation. The women I worked with ranged in age from teenagers to grandmothers, but they all shared the particular kind of wariness that comes from having trusted someone who used that trust as a weapon against them. In their stories, I heard echoes of Sarah's experience, the gradual isolation from friends and family, the systematic undermining of confidence and independence, the use of intimate knowledge as ammunition for psychological warfare. But I also witnessed their remarkable resilience and determination to rebuild their lives despite the trauma they'd endured. Watching these women reclaim their voices, rediscover their strengths, and slowly learn to trust their own judgment again provided hope that Sarah might eventually find her way to similar healing, even if that process took years to unfold. Through my work at the shelter, I began building a small, carefully chosen circle of friends who valued authenticity over appearances and understood that real strength sometimes looked like vulnerability rather than invulnerability. These were women who had faced their own battles with various forms of adversity and who appreciated honesty about life's complexities rather than polite pretense that everything was fine. Our friendships developed slowly and organically built on shared activities and common values rather than social obligations or community expectations. We met for coffee, not because it was required, but because we genuinely enjoyed each other's company. We shared our stories not because we sought pity, but because we'd learned that isolation amplifies trauma while connection facilitates healing. Despite finding genuine purpose in my volunteer work and meaningful connection with my small circle of trusted friends, the painful memories of Arthur's manipulation and Sarah's suffering remained constantly present like a chronic ache that occasionally flared into acute pain. The knowledge of what my daughter had endured, what she was probably still enduring, despite the improved circumstances, created a wound that no amount of positive activity could completely heal. Quiet evenings were particularly difficult when the day's activities gave way to solitude and reflection. During these times, I would find myself overcome by waves of grief for the vibrant, confident young woman Sarah had been before Arthur's psychological warfare had systematically dismantled her sense of self. I would look through old photographs from her childhood and college years, seeing the joy and optimism that had once characterized her approach to life, and feel the full weight of what had been stolen from both of us. The most painful photographs were the ones that showed Sarah during the early months of her relationship with Arthur, when she'd been glowing with what she'd believed was genuine love and mutual respect. Knowing what I now knew about his predatory behavior, I could see signs in those images that I'd missed at the time, the way he positioned himself to control the camera angle, the subtle tension in Sarah's smile when he was touching her, the calculated nature of his apparent affection. These weren't tears of self-pity, but rather a deep mourning for innocence lost, and futures that would never be possible. The bright, independent life Sarah had been building before Arthur's interference was gone forever, replaced by a more cautious and limited existence, shaped by the need to protect herself from further manipulation and abuse. Yet amidst this persistent sorrow, small moments of authentic joy began emerging with increasing frequency. These weren't grand celebrations or dramatic turning points, but rather quiet instances of contentment that felt precious precisely because they'd been hard-won through the process of rebuilding, rather than simply inherited from more innocent times. The genuine gratitude expressed by women at the shelter when I helped them navigate legal procedures or understand their financial options. The comfortable silence shared with my friend Margaret during our weekly walks around the lake, where conversation wasn't necessary because understanding had already been established. The unexpected beauty of a single rose blooming in the small garden I'd planted behind my new house, proof that life could still create something lovely, even in the most humble circumstances. These joys existed alongside my grief rather than replacing it, creating a complex emotional landscape where sorrow and contentment could coexist without canceling each other out. They represented evidence that meaning and purpose could still be found even after experiencing the worst that human nature had to offer, that resilience wasn't about forgetting pain, but about learning to carry it gracefully while remaining open to whatever beauty might still be possible. I occasionally received updates about Arthur through the inevitable networks of community gossip, though I neither sought out this information nor encouraged others to share it with me. His financial schemes had collapsed completely under the weight of multiple investigations, leaving him facing significant debt and ongoing legal scrutiny from several different agencies. His social standing had been utterly destroyed, transforming him from a respected member of the community into a pariah whom others actively avoided. The justice Arthur was experiencing wasn't the result of my direct intervention, but rather the natural consequence of his own actions finally catching up with him. His greed and manipulation had created a web of enemies and victims who were no longer willing to remain silent about his behavior, and the institutional systems designed to protect people from financial predators were functioning as they should. These reports of Arthur's downfall didn't bring me satisfaction or vindication. Instead, they served as cold confirmation that the universe sometimes provides its own justice without requiring victims to actively seek revenge. His maliciousness had ultimately led to his own destruction, leaving him with nothing but the bitter fruits of his exploitation and the knowledge that his life's work had been devoted to causing suffering rather than creating anything of lasting value. On a particularly quiet evening in late autumn, as I sat in my small living room, listening to the rain tap gently against the windows, I found myself drawn to an old song playing on the radio, a simple melody that Sarah and I had once sung together during car trips when she was young. The lyrics spoke of hope and resilience themes that had seemed effortlessly optimistic back when we'd harmonized together without any understanding of how deeply life could wound those who loved most completely. Hearing that familiar tune felt like receiving a message from a different lifetime, a poignant echo of the uncomplicated joy we'd once shared before predators like Arthur had taught us that trust could be weaponized and that intimate knowledge could become ammunition for psychological warfare. The melody carried memories of summer drives with the windows down, Sarah's young voice confidently carrying the harmony while I provided the melody, both of us believing that our happiness was permanent and protected. The song reminded me of the profound pain and loss I'd endured over the past year, but it also evoked the complex, unspoken love that still existed between Sarah and me, despite everything Arthur had done to corrupt and complicate our relationship. That love had become more fragile and careful than it had once been, filtered through layers of trauma and wariness that would probably never completely disappear, but it remained real and meaningful even in its damaged state. As I sat there listening to those familiar lyrics, I felt the familiar ache in my heart for the daughter who had been trapped and tortured by someone who should have cherished and protected her, for the innocent trust that had been systematically destroyed, for the bright future that had been stolen and replaced with something much more limited and fearful. The grief was as sharp as ever, but this time I didn't fight against it or try to transform it into something more productive. Instead, I allowed the sorrow to wash over me completely, accepting that some wounds, particularly those inflicted by the exploitation of the purest forms of love, might never truly heal in any conventional sense. Arthur's manipulation had become part of my identity, and Sarah's woven into the fabric of who we were in ways that couldn't be undone through therapy, justice, or the passage of time. This wasn't a moment of despair, but rather one of profound self-compassion, an acceptance of life's fundamental imperfections, and the understanding that healing doesn't necessarily mean forgetting or returning to a previous state of innocence. The scars Arthur had left on both Sarah and me were permanent, but they were also proof that we had survived something that was designed to destroy us completely. The recognition that I would always carry this pain brought with it an unexpected sense of freedom. I'd been approaching my recovery with the unconscious expectation that success would mean eliminating my grief and returning to the trusting, optimistic person I'd been before Arthur had entered our lives. But sitting in my quiet living room, surrounded by the simple life I'd built from the ruins of my previous existence, I understood that true healing might mean something entirely different. True healing meant learning to carry this emotional weight with grace and dignity, to acknowledge the scars without allowing them to define my entire existence or prevent me from experiencing whatever joy and meaning might still be possible. It meant understanding that I could still find beauty in the world, still form meaningful connections with others, still contribute to causes that mattered, even while carrying the permanent ache of maternal grief. This quiet acceptance brought with it a deeper level of peace than I'd experienced since this nightmare had begun. The constant internal struggle to overcome my pain, to move past Arthur's betrayal, to somehow return to a state of innocence that had been permanently destroyed, all of that exhausting effort could finally be released in favor of a more sustainable approach to living with trauma. I realized that my resilience didn't depend on erasing the past or pretending that Arthur's crimes hadn't fundamentally altered my understanding of human nature and family relationships. Instead, it came from integrating these devastating experiences into a life that could accommodate both sorrow and joy loss, and discovery, betrayal, and the tentative possibility of new forms of trust. Rising from my chair as the song ended and the radio moved on to other music, I felt a quiet strength that was different from anything I'd experienced before. This wasn't the naive confidence of someone who hadn't yet encountered real evil, nor was it the brittle determination of someone still actively fighting against overwhelming odds. Instead, it was the steady resilience of someone who had seen the worst that human nature could offer and had chosen to continue existing with integrity and compassion. I'd learned that love could be exploited, that trust could be betrayed, that even the most sacred relationships could be corrupted by those who viewed vulnerability as opportunity. But I'd also learned that these devastating truths didn't have to destroy my capacity for meaning, connection, and purposeful action. My future stretched ahead of me, not as a restoration of what had been lost, but as something entirely new, a tapestry woven with threads of both shadow and light sorrow, and contentment, hard-won wisdom, and carefully guarded hope. I would continue my work with survivors of abuse, finding purpose in helping others navigate the complex process of rebuilding after betrayal. I would nurture my small circle of genuine friendships, appreciating the rare gift of authentic connection in a world where manipulation was often disguised as love. There would be difficult moments ahead, anniversaries, that brought sharp pangs of loss, unexpected reminders of the family that had once existed, instances when Sarah's continued suffering felt almost unbearable to witness from my necessary distance. But there would also be continued growth, new opportunities to help others, small adventures that reminded me that life could still offer surprises and beauty to those who remained open to receiving them. Most importantly, I would carry forward the knowledge that my worth hadn't been determined by Arthur's manipulation, that my capacity for love hadn't been diminished by his inability to understand or respect it. The woman who had been systematically targeted by a sophisticated predator had emerged with her essential self-intact, scarred, but unbroken, isolated, but not without value, changed, but not defeated. Standing by my window and looking out at the quiet street where other people were living their own complex lives filled with joy and sorrow, triumph and loss, I felt a profound sense of integration. This was my life now, not the one I'd planned or expected, but unmistakably mine earned through suffering and built with intention, marked by visible scars, but animated by an enduring spirit that no amount of cruelty could extinguish. My new life, though fundamentally different from anything I'd once envisioned, has found its own rhythm of quiet fulfillment and purposeful action. It's not the complete traditional family I once dreamed of enjoying with Sarah and her husband, but rather something carved from the raw materials of immense fear and monstrous betrayal, and somehow that origin makes it more precious and authentic than anything built on naive assumptions about human goodness. I've discovered a deep self-sufficiency I never knew I possessed, developed through the necessity of rebuilding everything from scratch when the foundation of my previous life proved to be built on lies and manipulation. The wisdom I've gained from exploring the darkest corners of human nature has given me insights that I use to help other women recognize and escape from predatory relationships before the damage becomes irreversible. The work I do now at the women's shelter, the genuine friendships I've built with people who understand that strength sometimes looks like vulnerability, the small garden where I grow flowers that bloom despite difficult conditions, all of these represent forms of meaning and connection that feel more valuable because they've been earned through struggle rather than simply inherited from more innocent times. I am stronger now, wiser, and undeniably changed by what Sarah and I endured together and separately. The scars left by Arthur's psychological warfare remain visible in the way I approach new relationships with careful boundaries and the moments when grief still catches me unexpectedly. They've shaped me profoundly, but they no longer define the entirety of my existence or prevent me from experiencing joy, purpose, and authentic connection with others. These marks are part of my story now, evidence of battles fought and survived, but not the whole of my identity. My heart, though permanently marked by the knowledge of how completely trust can be betrayed, beats with a quiet resilience that I never knew I possessed until it was tested by circumstances I couldn't have imagined. Life has taught me that even the purest maternal love can be met with the darkest exploitation, and that some wounds, especially those inflicted through the manipulation of family bonds, never heal in any traditional sense. The ache of knowing what Sarah suffered, what she may still be suffering, despite our efforts to protect her, will always remain with me as a permanent reminder of how vulnerable love makes us. Yet I've learned that true freedom isn't found in the absence of pain or in dreams of revenge against those who've wronged us, but in accepting what is, while refusing to let betrayal poison what still could be. It's about finding the quiet strength to carry sorrows with grace while remaining open to whatever small joys and meaningful connections might still emerge from the wreckage of what we thought we knew about life and love. Some wounds never truly heal, but they remind us of the battles we've survived and the depth of our capacity to endure what feels impossible. And sometimes that quiet strength, that enduring echo of a mother's unwavering love, is more than enough to build a life worth living.